I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on.
We're talking at noon on July 24th. It's Tuesday, and there is a shaky truce between Israel and Iran, brokered in part by the United States. And I have with us the perfect person to dissect all of this, and it's Dr. John Alterman, our Brzezinski chair here at CSIS. John, welcome. The first thing I have to ask you is, now what?
It feels to me like from an Israeli perspective, they've done exactly what they wanted to do. From an Iranian perspective, what they've been doing isn't working. So getting to a different track is urgent. From a U.S. perspective, there's been a great success. So I think each side has an interest in moving on to another phase. I don't think this means the Iranians are necessarily going to be cooperative. The Israelis have a lot of serious challenges. The United States has serious challenges. But moving from the kinetic military piece of this to another piece means that the odds of this horribly spinning out of control are much reduced over what they were just 24 hours ago.
So one of the questions that I have is, okay, well, now what? Where does this leave the United States and our allies on Iran's issue of proliferation? We know that, well, actually, we don't know. We don't know where their enriched uranium stockpile actually is right now, whether it was taken out in one of the strikes. Chances are that they have saved some of it, if not all of it. Where does this leave Iran's nuclear program?
It's really unclear. And I think this is the challenge when you use military tools to accomplish fundamentally political goals, is you have to find a way to follow the military action with diplomatic action to secure a victory. There's not a military victory here. What the United States and Israel want to do is to use this as a pathway to eliminate the Iranian nuclear weapons program. What it could do instead is it accelerates the Iranian nuclear weapons program, persuading the Iranians that the only way to avoid another humiliation is to have a nuclear deterrent, to withdraw at some point from the non-proliferation treaty, covertly develop a weapon, and then, as North Korea did, as Pakistan did, as India did, make clear to the world that you have a nuclear weapon when you have a deterrent in hand. And so that the challenge for really the Trump administration, because this is not going to be something the Israelis are going to be involved in, they themselves are not members of the NPT. The challenge is, how do you take the position Iran is in now and convert it to one where you're able to get the highly enriched uranium out of the country, you're able to get the Iranians to stop enriching uranium beyond what they need for a civilian program. What kinds of concessions, what kinds of assurances do you have to give the Iranians to get there? Will the Iranians comply, or will the Iranians negotiate, secretly develop an option, and then do either a sudden withdrawal or something, which only leads to the Iranians developing a weapon, which a lot of people think would push the Saudis to develop the weapon, the Emiratis to develop a weapon, the Turks to develop a weapon. And we could end up in a situation where, rather than having just Israel as the only nuclear weapon state in the Middle East, you could have 4 or 5 nuclear weapon states in the Middle East. The other piece of this is, one of the things that's kept countries in developing nuclear weapons is feeling like they're under an American nuclear umbrella of extended deterrence, that the United States will defend these countries with nuclear weapons and extremists. It is possible that a sense the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East, going alone, pursuing an America First policy in a durable way, makes our allies and partners throughout the world feel that without being able to rely on an American nuclear deterrent, they have to develop their own deterrents. So there's a way, ironically, that rather than moving us away from a more proliferated world, this is an inflection point moving us toward a more proliferated world. It's diplomacy that can get you a different outcome, but you really have to follow the military action with aggressive, effective diplomatic action.
And we have to say, this is not the neighborhood in the world that you want every nation to have a nuclear weapon in, correct?
Well, I mean, there's some political scientists who argue that a more proliferated world is a more secure world because everybody's intimidated. As a historian, I would say that's another sign you shouldn't really listen to political scientists. But you certainly have people like Ken Wall saying, no, that's how you get security is everybody has nukes.
Can we live with an Iran with a nuclear weapon?
It has been the policy of, I think, every president since Reagan to assert that we cannot have Iran with a nuclear weapon. The question then becomes, what can the U.S. do to stop it? And the North Korea model is a disturbing one because the United States was committed to North Korea not having a weapon. And you could look at North Korea with a weapon and say that's been an effective deterrent that has kept the United States from attacking North Korea, that in many ways it's worked. And it's hard for me to imagine exactly how all this will play out. One of the questions that's worth asking is, under what circumstances do you have a change in government in Iran? I don't think this leads to it. I think you're going to have a rally around the flag, and I also think you're going to have excuses for the security services to become more aggressive. But if you have an Iran that is struggling to grapple with the energy transition in 10 or 15 or 20 years, the government will have many fewer resources to rely on. You could simultaneously have the possibility of the government of Iran weakening, collapsing, and the government of Iran having a nuclear weapons capability. If those two things come together, that could be a really challenging environment for the United States, but it could also be an environment where the United States says, we're less reliant, the world's less reliant on the Middle East for energy. It doesn't matter. So I think we could be looking at a very different security environment in the Middle East, depending on how a lot of things unfold. I think, to me, that's one of the reasons why it's so important that the nonproliferation diplomacy is effective now, because because I think the security environment in the Middle East has a lot more question marks the further out you go. And if you start putting nuclear weapons in the mix, I think things become very, very uncertain.
I want to come back to North Korea in a minute and also talk a little bit about China and Russia. But first, I want to ask you, does Iran have leverage because nobody knows where their stockpile of enriched uranium is?
Iran has leverage partly because it has secrecy. Iran has leverage partly because Iranians' willingness to both endure pain and inflict pain is higher than a lot of other countries. They're going to insist on getting something in exchange. And to me, the Iranians have demonstrated one of their strategic goals is just to be in negotiations. If the Iranians are in negotiations, then they can trade, they can get things, they can get concessions. To me, the Iranians' greatest fear has always been that they're ignored, that they're left to suffer in silence and wither. And I think that there's a part of the Iranian calculus that they just want to be in negotiations for the sake of being in negotiations, because that will present opportunities for them.
Yep.
And to me, their leverage is they're really comfortable negotiating. They're really patient. This is the most important strategic objective for them. And for us, it's one of a whole bunch of objectives. I think the Iranians feel they know that game. They know the nuclear file backwards and forwards. They have negotiators who've been doing this for decades. They'd welcome the chance to be in nuclear negotiations.
John, it's fascinating. They have famously tied up negotiations for a very long time in the past, thinking about how long it took for the President Obama to get the JCPOA agreement settled. Is that their goal here, is to tie up the United States in negotiations for some time and then possibly rebuild? I mean, the Wall Street Journal has an interesting editorial this morning, and I'll quote it. They say, military humiliated, Mr. Khomeini could fall prey to a popular uprising, or he could fall to an elite coup from elements of the regime or military that see the Ayatollah's policies as driving them into ground. In either case, it's hard to imagine a successor that would be worse for U.S. interests and peace and harmony.
I I think the Iranians see themselves necessarily bargaining against a stronger power indefinitely. They think U.S. hostility to the regime is built in. They think U.S. power vis-a-vis the regime is built in. And they have been developing asymmetric tools and their negotiating capability for decades. That's the hand they've been dealt. I think they will sometimes rely on asymmetric tools, sometimes rely on negotiations, but those are the elements it has. As we've seen in the last week, if you use conventional military force, the Iranians can't win. And they've had their air defenses decimated. They've had their facilities bombed. They can't win a symmetrical battle
And they've had a lot of their generals and their nuclear sciences taken out as well.
by the Israelis with, they think, the acquiescence, at least, of the United States, if not the support. So I don't think the Iranians see accommodation as an attractive option because I don't think they think the accommodation has limits. They see the accommodation as a quick pathway to surrender, defeat, dissolution of the Islamic Republic and the regime that all of them rely on. So I think it's different paths of resistance. Some of the resistance is through negotiation. Some of the resistance is through asymmetric tools, whether it's proxies or cyber or terrorist attacks or all those other kinds of things the Iranians do. They see that as a way to get more of what they want, blunting the hostility and surviving. But I don't think the Iranians see an option to reverse U.S. hostility. I think they think ultimately the strategic goal of the United States is regime change. And I think as long as they see that as the goal of the United States, their acquiescence to U.S. demands is going to be constrained. Now, that being said, there's a way in which this regime thrives on its opposition to the United States. The regime gets a lot of money through sanctions busting. A more normal Iran in the world would probably mean the collapse of this government. So I think that they're sort of settled in to being sanctioned, to being isolated. They think it's sort of their fate, and their goal is to survive, not thrive, survive. And I think that's kind of where we're in for. I don't think this is the beginning of a huge bright spot in the Middle East. I think it's moving the conflict to a potentially better situation, but also, as I suggested, a potentially more threatening one.
Yeah, John, a lot of talk about regime change. How strong do you think the regime remains in Iran?
Relatively strong, partly because the government remains a major energy exporter, and that gives them a lot of resources to control the economy, to buy support. I think the network of basically protection rackets and sanctions busting operations gives them additional patronage support. There's really no alternative to the regime, and you can't beat something with nothing. We saw that through the Arab Spring, that there's no major opposition figure with any traction in Iran the way you had Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. And the other piece is that the way the revolution played out in 1979, where some people were quite optimistic about what it would do, and it sort of turned dark, in some ways inoculated Iranians to the appeal of revolutions because the last one turned out so poorly. Now, you could argue that's not really the way it works, and France went through all kinds of revolutions and counter-revolutions in the 19th century, but when I talk to Iranians, the sense that I get from people that if only we had a revolution, everything would be fine, is not something I hear. Instead, I get a sense of put your head down, try to survive. These guys are criminals, they're thugs, they're incompetent, but what can we do?
John, I wanted to ask you about China, Russia, and North Korea. There's this unholy alliance with them and Iran, but so far, all three, China, North Korea, Russia, have remained relatively quiet. Do you expect them to play a role, especially China and Russia, in diplomacy? And I guess also, do you expect North Korea to try to covertly help them with their nuclear program?
They have all kinds of conversations with the North Koreans about strategy, whether they trust the North Koreans, whether they have a respect for the North Koreans. It's hard for me to tell. Iranian officials claim the North Koreans gave them some advice about how to engage diplomatically with the Trump administration. The advice that they got was deal only with Trump, don't deal with his subordinates. He'll make a deal with you. That's what the Iranians have said to me. I don't think the North Koreans are going to be consequential. The more interesting question is really the China Russia angle. Uh, there's been a lot of commentary about how durable the relationship is between Russia and Iran, how the Ukraine war made them into allies. But in fact, the Russians have not been consequential at all defending Iranians. They didn't come to Iran's defense. They didn't really do anything that helped the Iranians in their moment of greatest need. The Chinese have been happy to talk about how strategic Iran is, but in fact, the Chinese seem never to miss an opportunity to remind the Iranians who's boss.
Because they're buying their oil.
Well, because China represents 30% of Iranian trade and Iran represents less than 1% of Chinese trade. I think the Chinese consistently use the Iranians to their benefit, but don't feel any allegiance to the Iranians. I think from an Iranian perspective, they must look at the last couple weeks and say, we really don't have any friends we can rely on. And I think that partly influences the Iranian desire to find an off ramp. Going forward, I think you're likely to see China want to have a role in any sort of settlement because the Chinese want the prestige of it. My guess is the Russians will try to undermine something they're not part of. And that's more on the sort of negative side with the Russian sabotage of things that don't involve them. I don't think the Chinese would sabotage, but the Chinese will present themselves as a prestigious major power that deserves inclusion because I think that's part of the broader Chinese sense of self and Chinese sense of the role in the world. The Chinese got a lot of publicity from presiding over the normalization agreements between Saudi Arabia and Iran, really driven by the Saudis, but with credit accruing to China. I think the Chinese will look for a way to try to rise above and try to use this as a way to build their credibility. But, to me, if you look at everything that's happened in the Middle East since October 7th, 2023, it's demonstrated the Chinese really aren't consequential on security issues in the Middle East. They're just not there. The diplomacy, successful or unsuccessful, the war fighting, successful or unsuccessful, has all centered around the United States. And that the Chinese have barely been present. They certainly haven't moved things toward resolution, even when Chinese interests are heavily affected, for example, with security threats in the Red Sea, where so much Chinese trade to Europe goes. So I think that in some ways, what we've seen in the last year and a half is that Chinese still aren't big security players in the Middle East. They aren't advancing the interests of their partners like Iran. China and Russia both are countries that fundamentally don't believe in alliances. And Iran is finding this out the hard way that whatever agreements they strike, whatever deals they make, when push comes to shove, China and Russia consider them a lesser power and won't lift a finger to advance Iranian interests unless it's in direct support of their own interests. I think that's a hard message for the Iranians to accept, but that's the reality. And it's certainly one of the conclusions that the Iranians have drawn from the last couple weeks.
John, we haven't talked about Israel in this equation yet. A lot of talk about whether the Israel and the United States, the Trump administration, are aligned. It seems on some things they are, other things they might not be. Where do you see the Netanyahu-led government going from here? They've had a pretty spectacular military success, but there has been damage in Israel. Where do you see them going from here?
On the one hand, I wonder how much this really bolsters Netanyahu's political standing. It might. Iran is it's a consensus issue in Israeli politics in a country with virtually no consensus issues. The sense that Iran represents an existential threat to Israel, and Netanyahu was able to move the Trump administration from a commitment to negotiating with the Iranians to doing, well, as I said, Israeli governments have wanted the Americans to do for years and years and years, take out the facility at Fordo that Israelis couldn't take out. Only the United States could do it. Netanyahu managed to get the United States to do it without ruining the U.S. relationship, without tipping off a war in the Middle East. So it's quite possible that Netanyahu is able domestically to rise. So I was talking to somebody today who was speculating Netanyahu might call early elections because he's accomplished something really significant.
And let's not forget, 2 weeks ago, his government almost fell.
Right. And from his perspective, and from the perspective of many Israelis, this was a remarkable gamble that paid off. And Netanyahu has taken all kinds of gambles for the last year that have paid off, from assassinating Ismail Haniyeh to assassinating Hassan Nasrallah, the whole Hezbollah operation, time after time. Netanyahu, who's normally pretty risk-averse in national security issues, has rolled the dice, taken all kinds of gambles, and advanced Israeli interests. There's still a question in my mind whether Israel can turn the corner on Gaza. There's still a question on my mind what might happen if there's a humanitarian eruption in Gaza that really changes the equation. Whether Netanyahu uses this political moment to make a deal in Gaza, whether he feels this is another gamble he'll take, he doesn't have to make a deal in Gaza, I think attention will shift back to Gaza over the next month. I don't know how Israel thinks about getting through that, but I think the other question is Netanyahu's taken a lot of gambles that have paid off. Does that make him too willing to take risks? Does he take a reckless risk? What happens if there's a gamble that doesn't pay off? What are the consequences for Netanyahu politically? What are the consequences for regional security? There's a danger of overconfidence, I think, after such a tremendous accomplishment from an Israeli perspective. And of course, the question, does President Trump feel Netanyahu now owes me, and Netanyahu misjudges Trump? So I think, part of being Israeli is you never totally relax. Part of being prime minister of Israel is your enemies are everywhere and there are constantly threats. I don't think Netanyahu is really going to be able to relax politically, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's really a shift in Israeli politics over the next 6 months. And I couldn't predict which way it would shift and what consequences it would have both for Israel and for regional security.
Yeah, one thing I wonder is, will this successful operation on Iran make Netanyahu less dependent on the far-right coalition that he's built with Ben-Gvir, Smotrich? Is he still really in their pocket to stay in power? Does it dilute that a bit? I guess that's a hard question to answer, but one I'd throw out there.
I'm not sure that he doesn't value having folks on the right that he has to constrain, right? If he's the most rightward member of the coalition, or there's a perception he's on the right, I think that puts him in a different position. He wants to be the one. I know they're there, but I'm the decider. And I think he likes being in that position and would feel less comfortable if he had to be the one putting forward what people on the outside, and some people on the inside, would consider extreme views. I think he likes having them as a heat shield and an excuse, just because that gives him more political freedom.
John, thanks as always for this tremendous analysis. A lot to think about here, as always, and really, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Andrew.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.